Welcome to Her Success Matters, a podcast exploring how advisors can work together to build a pathway for women to succeed in financial services. I am your host, Christine Shaw, CEO of InvestmentNews. This podcast will give you a rare insider access to the top financial services executives who are taking action to break down the barriers for the next generation of female advisors. Today's guest is Sonya Dreizler. Sonya is a speaker, author, consultant, and subject matter expert on impact investing, ESG, and socially responsible investing. Sonya was also a CEO of an independent broker-dealer RIA financial services firm. Welcome, Sonya. So happy to have you here today as our guest.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yes, in our new world of normal, connecting virtually, I'm really enjoying this platform and the ability to connect with people like you. So thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to chat.
So Sonya, tell our listeners a little bit more about your background and how you got into the financial services industry to begin with.
Sure. Now I'm a consultant and writer and speaker. But before I was in this current role, I was the CEO of, like you said, an independent BD RIA hybrid. And the way I got there was I started really at entry level at the same company. I had it was when I had first moved to San Francisco. There was not a lot of work available in my field of choice. And so when I had the opportunity to interview for an executive assistant position in a financial services company that I didn't know much about, I took it and hit it off with the CEO in our interview. And she offered me a job on the spot. And I said yes, also on the spot. And so that was as executive assistant to the CEO of a broker-dealer. And she was a great mentor to me and sort of threw me into the deep end. It was less executive assistant and more do all of the projects that need a hand, including, I think the first one was performance reporting, being the liaison on performance reporting between advisors and the performance reporting company that we used. And that is a really good way to learn because if you don't know about investing or the financial services industry, performance reporting gets into the details really quickly. And so that's one of the ways I learned. And my boss was really helpful and had an open door policy for me asking lots of questions, which I did. And it was a really good start. And I stayed at that company for a long time. I did well in that position. So she moved me from role to role, reorganizing different parts of the company as I went. And so many years later, I had been promoted a variety of times and eventually became our chief operating officer. I did that for about 5 years. And then when the CEO role opened up because the CEO left unexpectedly, I threw my hat in the ring during the executive search and got that role too. So the same role that had hired me, I got to sit in that chair eventually. It was it was an honor, really, and a really wonderful working experience, a great way to learn. And it sounds very linear when I tell the story here in a couple of minutes, but of course it wasn't. It only sounds and looks linear in retrospect. There were lots of zigs and zags along the way. So that's my background. We sold the firm in 2016 to a larger independent BD RIA hybrid, and I started consulting and then speaking and writing.
That's amazing. So first of all, congratulations on all your success. And I love the beginning of your story because it's very similar to mine, whereby I started my career as a young woman, also as an executive assistant to a CEO. And you're right. Yeah, there's no better way to learn than to just roll up your sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty. But how unusual for you to have begun your journey there and then went all the way up to rise to the CEO, and now you're on your own with this very successful business. And it really leans into what the purpose of this podcast is all about, because there's a lot of women who naturally start in roles in executive assistants, but they don't either have the pathway, confidence, courage, or mentor to help navigate them from assistant level to CEO. So can you talk a little bit about your experience there and what people and experiences helped to create that pathway for you?
Oh, gosh. There's a lot of people to credit along the way. Watching my parents each of them ran their own businesses when I was growing up. So sort of watching that and having those two as my two main role models as a kid is huge, of course, right? And then one of the things that I don't think we talk about enough in financial services that was part of my career journey is the importance that introductions can play, right? And that's how many of us get our first jobs and also secondary and third jobs in financial services. And so I had an introduction like that. My dad made the introduction for me at the broker dealer where I had the interview. And so that's a big one. And it's a level of privilege that I think most folks in financial services don't even consider that we have, but it's huge. So that was one. And of course, the CEO who hired me, she poured a lot into me. She had a lot of faith in me, definitely more faith than I had in myself to learn and grow and excel at something I didn't have experience in. It's taken me a long time to have the confidence to see a problem that I don't currently have the skills to solve and know that I can solve it. And I have to develop the skills along the way. I didn't have that confidence that I could build those skills along the way until fairly recently, embarrassingly enough, probably in the last 5 years. But I think that's pretty common. So I'm happy to talk about that because I think it's something that holds people and maybe especially women back, not being able to do something perfectly. So just not doing it at all. It isn't a way to get anything done in business. That's not the right attitude.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, there's a lot of research out there that suggests confidence for women in particular is a main barrier to them advancing their career, speaking up for themselves. In fact, I think we're now all familiar with the term imposter syndrome that is more well known in women, whereby they don't believe they believe that they're not don't have the required skills for the job at hand, therefore they hold back. And
Right.
It's important to talk about that and how to build confidence for women, both as someone who's done it yourself and created your own successful career, and as role models, and how we can help women in developing their confidence. But I want to go back to what you mentioned a minute ago, which is your father, who was one of the first socially responsible advisors, or one of the first advocates for socially responsible advisement in the country. So you mentioned, of course, we all have a connection. A lot of us do, not all. I shouldn't say all, but a lot of us have connections like that. Did he influence you in terms of choosing financial services in general, or was it more of, hey, here's a connection, I can help you get your first start?
Yes. So having a father in the business definitely did influence me, although not necessarily in the way you might think. Because my dad was a financial planner, I grew up very comfortable with the subject of money, personal finance, talking about money, and had a kind of general idea about at least what investing is, but I wasn't at all interested in it. And specifically did not want to go into financial services. I did not want to do that. I did not want to be a physical therapist, which is what my mom did. Yes. I think I was just, I've always had a very independent streak and wanted to forge my own path. And so really was not at all interested in following in the footsteps of either of my parents. And yet, but when I was and I have moved to San Francisco fairly soon after college, there just wasn't a lot of work in San Francisco. It was post.com bust. And so I was not working in the field I wanted to. I really didn't like my job. So when I had the opportunity to, take another, to try something else, it seemed like fine. I'll try this. In fact, I really was so uninterested in the field that I told the CEO in the interview, I said, I'm not interested in this field. I just want to be honest with you. And she asked me to make a 1-year commitment to the job. And I did. And that's that same job where I was there for 13 years and ended up as the CEO.
Well, you are a woman of your word. I will give you that. And, it's interesting. So you have a comment in there that I think resonates with a lot of women, which is the whole thing about speaking about money, talking about money. A lot of women are not comfortable talking about money. And I'm glad to hear that because of your father being a financial advisor, that talking about money and having a mother who is a successful business person as well and had her own business made you comfortable with talking about money. And I think that in general, as women, we have to become more comfortable about talking about money, which is why pulling women into financial advisor roles is so important.
Absolutely.
It allows a format where you can go to the table and speak to somebody who can understand and empathize with you. So tell us a little bit more about how you would encourage women to come into financial services and why it is important for women to have a voice when it comes to money.
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's one that, to be honest, I really struggle with about whether to encourage women to work in this field. I know that's probably not the answer that you want, but it's true. It's been a really good job for me, and I've really enjoyed it, but there's just so much discrimination and harassment still that when I speak with young women who are interested in this field, I feel compelled to give them an honest answer that it's not perfect and not even close. It will likely be an uphill battle. You're going to need mentors. You're going to need a lot of resolve. And even then, it might not be enough. But if you can find the right place and something that you're doing that you really enjoy, you can have a great deal of influence. And having more women represented in the field is so extraordinarily important, not just to the field itself, but to the broader general public. And yet I feel really conflicted when young women ask me that question. I know that's a really kind of honest and vulnerable answer, but it's the true one for me.
And that's important. I mean, we need to speak the truth about what experiences have happened. And throughout this podcast series, I've spoke to several women who have experienced similar levels of discrimination or challenges. And that's why something like this is so important, because we need more women and people in general talking about that and helping to solve the problem. In fact, in one of my podcast episodes, I actually interviewed Mike Durbin of Fidelity, a man, no less. And what people don't realize is there's many men out there who don't want to discriminate, and they have a program there, Men as Allies. And it's important that we understand it's everyone's problem to solve. And while I agree it's more prevalent within financial services, this is not unique to financial services. And it's why there's so many women's initiatives taking place and more conversations happening that we absolutely can do a better job in bringing those barriers down and acknowledging discrimination and workable solutions and removing the tolerance, having a zero tolerance policy for that. So speaking of that, that leads me into Do Better. Tell us a little bit more about that and how now your voice in that series, Do Better, is helping on this.
I would love to talk about Do Better. And before I answer that question, I want to add on to something you said about how it's not just up to women to make space for more women, and that it's also up to men. And I would amplify that and say that it is primarily up to men. They are the gatekeepers. They are primarily the ones in the C-suite, the boards. They are the ones making top level hiring decisions. and it's men's responsibility to bring more women on and to make sure that their policies and procedures are ones that are fair and increase participation of women in the workforce in their companies. And absolutely, men can be allies and mentors. In fact, actually two of my strongest mentors and advocates have been men, and I am so incredibly grateful for the role that they've played in my career. So yes, let's talk about Do Better. Gosh, I could spend all day talking about it. What aspect of it would you like to most to know?
Tell me what motivated you to create the series and what the purpose is and what you hope to accomplish by that.
Yeah, the intended audience is actually men, although it's resonated very much with women. And the intended audience was not just men, but men who want to do better and be better allies. Because the reason I started it was because I had read a couple of many different statistics and articles and surveys about the prevalence of discrimination and harassment in financial services, specifically gender-based discrimination and harassment. And the workplace surveys show this huge gap. In fact, I think there's an InvestmentNews one that I quoted in or linked in one of the first pieces of Do Better that showed that something like only 4% of men thought it was that discrimination was a serious problem in financial services, and of course the percentage of women that think that is much higher. And so there's this huge gap, this delta between what men think is happening and what women think is happening to women. And no number of stories of statistics or surveys seems to be changing that gap, that perception gap. And so I started to think about this because when I have my own stories of discrimination and harassment, and when I meet new women, new contacts in financial services that are women, it's one of the first things that women talk about. I've noticed is we share our own stories of discrimination, of harassment, who to stay away from, be careful of this guy, don't go in the elevator with this guy, whatever it is, both protecting and sharing and sort of commiserating together with these stories. But we only share them with other women for a number of reasons, for mostly safety and protection. It can be very scary and sometimes dangerous to our careers or to our physical safety to speak these stories out loud publicly for so many reasons that I get into in the series. But what I started thinking about was men, most men are not doing this discrimination or harassment, or they don't think they are. And the women see it, but we can't talk about it publicly. So men don't have the opportunity to hear these stories. So I wanted to talk about why we don't tell our stories. So I put a call out on social media as I was writing what I thought was one article about why we don't tell our stories of harassment and discrimination. And because I didn't want the article to be just about my experience. So I asked if any women wanted to share their stories of harassment or discrimination or assault, share them with me, and then I could share them anonymously on their behalf. And I thought I would get one or two stories, round out the article, send it out. And I got 40 stories in maybe 24 hours. And then, of course, they also kept coming in. And so I realized it was much, much bigger. And so I sat with the stories and sort of put them together. And as I read them all, I could see these themes emerging among the stories and then took those stories and put them into the themes and really tried to reflect on each theme and have these women's stories be heard, and then think a little bit about the solutions as well.
I think what you talked about is so important, and that's why we specifically have put this podcast around the C-suite, because what we understand is there are many, many, many women with a lot of stories out there. What's important is, how do we solve the problem? How do we make progress? And to your point, the men are predominantly the gatekeepers, and that's just not me or you saying that. That's just statistics, right? So there are more men in the C-suite and management roles than there are women. So statistically, that just is the case. And what we have seen is men don't necessarily do it deliberately. It happens because it's behavior that was learned and tolerated over years, and it takes a long time to make those changes, to see the benefits of the changes. So I really want to pivot into, you were CEO, you're now an advocate for this type of cause and action. So what things can CEOs or people in executive management do, or initiatives or actions they can take to help create a different culture and way forward so we can encourage women to choose this as a career?
Gosh, there's so many things. And I mean, it depends on the company. It depends on the size. It depends on the resources. The first thing that everybody can do, not just C-suite, but anybody can do, is stop and listen. And that was the first part. My intention for the first part of the series was just listen to the stories, let them sink in, and understand the depth and breadth of this problem, because it's huge and we can't solve a problem before we understand what it is. And so I would take that listening at whatever level of size company you have, and start listening to your own employees, past and present. And then there are certainly there's changes to the way that hiring is done. There's taking forced arbitration for sexual harassment out of employment contracts is really important. There's so many different ways to solve for this. There's pay equity, making sure that women and men are paid the same. And there's a variety of different ways of thinking about this, but financial services is pretty behind on that in general.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there are a lot of actions you can put into your company overall. So it doesn't have to be necessarily at the CEO level. However, you need the support of the CEO to get these programs and initiatives approved.
Absolutely. So, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And in fact, I have a whole list. I've taken the work from Do Better because there was so much. It was so well received and got so much more attention than I was expecting, which I'm so incredibly grateful for. And so I took it and I I have a whole site built around the series called dobettersolutions.com. And I have a bunch of lists of actions that both individuals and companies can do. So while we can't get into each one there, while we can't get into each one here on the podcast, I have a number of them listed for each different topic area so that both companies and individuals can go there, use it as a resource, and start to do better immediately today in their own company and their own work.
Great. So, Sonya, that is dobettersolutions.com, and listeners could go online and get a list of very specific actions that they can incorporate into their day-to-day businesses and practices to help.
Yes.
That's amazing.
And I was going to do a big launch of this new business line for me, but then, then everything changed in the last couple of months. I was planning to do this for March, and then decided that I'm not going to be doing some large launch of anything in March or April or May until we get back to some level of normalcy from this pandemic. So it's sort of a soft launch, and I welcome anybody to have a look and give me your feedback. And I'm really excited to be traveling, speaking, writing about this more, and hopefully getting to see people and help and speak in person when that is a possibility.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, that Women Advisor Summit is always a great place for you to do that. So
yes, I've been to the last few in San Francisco. It's wonderful.
Yes, it is. And we appreciate that. So, the other final topic I want to discuss is having a role model. So, you were very fortunate. And I love that you describe your mom as your number one woman in business role model. So, tell listeners about the importance of having a role model and how that can help you along the pathway for building your career.
Yeah, gosh, watching my mom grow up, I didn't know she was my role model when I was watching. She was just my mom, right? But I got to watch her build. I watched her quit her job because she was not being treated fairly and she was not being paid the same as the men doing the same with the same role, who I don't know if they were doing the same quality of work she was or not. I was pretty young, but I do remember she wasn't being paid the same. And she asked for a raise and her boss said no. And so I watched her be very frustrated with that and decide to go out on her own. And it was a big deal for our family. And so I got to watch her start her own business and grow her business. And she brought a lot of her business questions to me. Even as a kid, I loved thinking about business issues and employee issues. It was really fun and interesting. So I grew up with that kind of mindset, and I can't put my finger on exactly what it was that influenced me, just because I lived in my mom's sphere and really got to absorb so much of her awesomeness for years. And so she's certainly a role model, and I've had many and continue to have many role models. That one of the interesting things about being in maybe the middle of my career right now, I say maybe because I don't know how long it will last, but it's not the beginning anymore. And one of the great things is that some of my peers are my role models now. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really great to be friends with your role models and to be learning from people who are younger than me. It doesn't go only, I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't go only one direction. There's so many people to learn from if you are open and listening. And even some of the people that I mentor, I feel like they mentor me too. It goes two directions.
I love that you say that, because what people don't, well, one, the point is having a role model is so important, because we can all get caught in the narrative of our own head. And if you don't have other people to help you out or to relate to or to talk to, then sometimes it can be challenging. And we're all human, so we all have those moments. And having a role model is critical, and they can come in a variety of different ways to you. And I'm so happy for you that you had a mom who was able to play that role in your career and life. That's
yeah,
great.
Absolutely. And for women who are, sort of younger in their careers, absolutely look for a mentor. And those can also come in a variety of forms. They can be, very formal mentorships or informal. And what I would suggest is, if you have a mentor and you've agreed on this sort of mentor-mentee relationship, assuming that the mentor is, further along in her career, maybe an executive, maybe busy, be thoughtful about the time that you spend with him or her and come prepared. It's much easier, speaking now from the mentor side instead of the mentee, it's really much easier for me to help when the questions are specific and tailored. Like, I could use an introduction at XYZ company. Do you know anybody? Or what should I do about this specific problem? It's nice to be able to have a catch up or like go to coffee and really talk broadly. But when I can help on really specific things, those very tailored questions are very useful. And I think that some mentees think that that's bothersome or maybe over asking of a mentor, but it's actually really helpful to be very specific about what your needs are as a mentee.
I agree. I think that just being specific, being mindful of someone's time are all important things.
Yes.
So Well, this is great. So let me just summarize some of the things we talked about and some of the actions from the conversation. So I think, as you described at the beginning, it's about listening. You have to be willing to hear, listen, and acknowledge and recognize that there are challenges out there, and it's not just a fictitious myth. It's true, and these problems exist. So listening is an important part of it. Confidence, having confidence as a woman is another really important part of it. Being comfortable about talking about money, especially if you're going to choose financial services as a career. We talked about role models and mentorships, and then the actions, which again, I'll restate to everybody. You've done your series Do Better, and people can go to dobettersolutions.com and they can look up very specific actions that you've outlined in your series, which is fantastic. So I really appreciate all of that. And my final question that I ask all my guests is, please state in your words why her success matters.
Oh, gosh. Well, there's certainly a moral or ethical answer here, right? Her success matters because she's a human and we should care about people. And then there's also the business answer. Her success matters because not alienating women means having access to 100% of the talent pool. And top talent is the best asset a business can ask for.
That is fantastic. I couldn't have said that better myself. So, Sonya, I want to really thank you for your time, making time for us today, sharing your story, your perspective, and more importantly, your actions and series with Do Better, dobettersolutions.com. So thank you very much. And it was a pleasure having you as my guest today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's such a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Her Success Matters. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available, and share this podcast with others that believe her success matters.
The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Investment News. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service providers with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.